In the shadows of Britain's underworld, revenge is rarely swift or clean. It is often a drawn-out, theatrical performance of cruelty, intended to send a permanent message. When one man crossed the wrong person, the streets whispered that a reckoning was coming, but no one, not the police, not the hardened career criminals, and certainly not the victim, expected the sheer scale of what happened next. A killing so brutal, so intensely personal, that it silenced even those who thought they had seen everything. Tonight, we uncover the revenge murder that shook the entire foundation of the UK underworld. On the morning of June 19, 2003, the picturesque silence of the Cheshire countryside was shattered by screams that went unheard by the outside world. Inside a structure known as Burnt House Farm, Brian Waters, a devoted father of two, was being tortured to death in front of his own family. 3 hours of unimaginable suffering. 123 separate external injuries. And perhaps the most sadistic element of all, his adult children were forced to watch every horrific moment. How does a mere $20,000 debt, a relatively small sum in the grand scheme of narcotics trafficking, lead to this level of medieval brutality? How does a dispute over money spiral into one of the most savage revenge murders in British criminal history? It involved 6 masked men, a stolen horsebox, a cowshed transformed into a torture chamber, and a crime boss determined to carve a reputation out of flesh and bone. They made his children watch. They made him beg for mercy. They showed none. This is the story of Brian Waters, a man who made one fatal mistake, who thought he could ignore a debt to a man who ruled through terror, and who paid the ultimate price. Before we reveal how this nightmare unfolded, and how investigators tracked the killers across Europe for 16 years, if you are prepared for one of the most disturbing cases in UK crime history, hit that subscribe button. What happened at Burnt House Farm will stay with you long after this video ends. To understand the horror of his death, we must first understand the life of Brian Waters. Before the headlines and the graphic court testimony, Brian was remembered by those closest to him not as a criminal, but as a loving and caring father. He was the kind of man who would give the shirt off his back to a stranger. A man defined by his generosity and his fierce devotion to his family. For most of his adult life, Brian worked in construction, honest, back-breaking labor that puts food on the table but takes a toll on the body. However, the tragedy of Brian's life began with a mundane misfortune. According to his wife Julie, Brian suffered career-ending injuries on a job site. In the construction industry, your body is your only asset. Once it breaks, the paycheck stops. As the years passed, the walls began to close in. Finding steady work became impossible for a man whose physical strength was compromised. Yet the bills kept coming. Brian had children to support, and a lifestyle to maintain. In the mid-1990s, facing mounting financial pressure and seeing no legitimate way out, Brian Waters made a decision that would ultimately seal his fate. He did not turn to crime out of malice or greed, but out of desperation, a common gateway for many who find themselves trapped in the underworld. He turned to cannabis dealing. By 1998, he had established a sophisticated operation in the Netherlands, spending his time abroad overseeing the growth and transport of product. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a pragmatic solution to a financial problem. But in the criminal world, there is no such thing as easy money. There are always strings attached, and those strings are often held by men who value violence more than human life. Brian's attempt to save his family would eventually lead to their destruction. During his frequent trips between Holland and Britain, smuggling cannabis and managing the logistics of international drug trafficking, Brian Waters crossed paths with the man who would eventually orchestrate his annihilation. John Wilson, a 54-year-old crime boss based in Glossop, Derbyshire, was a relic of an old-school criminal hierarchy, a man whose authority was absolute and whose reputation was built on a bedrock of fear. Wilson was not a petty street dealer. He was a kingpin who viewed himself as untouchable. In this world, reputation is currency, and Wilson hoarded it greedily. Brian began taking side jobs for Wilson, acting as a trusted courier and a go-between for dealers in the Netherlands. For a time, the arrangement was mutually beneficial. Brian moved product, money changed hands, and the machinery of the underworld hummed along quietly. But in the summer of 2002, the gears ground to a halt. Brian was stopped by customs officers at a port in Amsterdam. He was carrying $20,000 in cash money that belonged to John Wilson. Whether it was payment for a shipment or proceeds from a sale mattered less than the cold, hard reality of the law. Unable to prove the legitimacy of the funds, the cash was seized by authorities. In that sterile customs office, Brian Waters' fate was effectively sealed. To a rational businessman, a $20,000 loss might be written off as the cost of doing business in a high-risk industry. But John Wilson was not a rational businessman. He was a narcissist who ruled by intimidation. When Brian failed to repay the lost money, dodging calls and making excuses, Wilson did not see a financial loss. He saw an act of open rebellion. By 2002, rumors began to circulate through the grapevine that Brian Waters was running a secret, highly profitable cannabis farm in Cheshire. The exact location was a closely guarded secret, but the mere existence of the farm was an insult to Wilson. Here was a man who owed him a debt, yet was operating a lucrative enterprise and refusing to pay up. Determined to make a terrifying example of Brian, Wilson needed to locate this hidden grow operation. To do so, he did not turn to typical thugs. He hired professionals with a chillingly specific skill set. Wilson recruited cousins Christopher Guest Moore Jr. and James Raven, two men who were uniquely qualified for the task of hunting a human being. The irony of their involvement was dark and profound. Both men had extensive backgrounds in surveillance and deception, but not from the criminal world at least. Not originally. They had worked as undercover TV researchers for major networks like the BBC and Channel 4. Their day jobs involved infiltrating criminal gangs to expose them for documentaries. They were experts at blending in, gathering intelligence, and remaining invisible. They knew how to watch without being seen, how to track a target, and how to use the very tools of investigative journalism for lethal ends. They were wolves in sheep's clothing, using the techniques of the media to facilitate a gangland execution. In June 2003, Christopher and Raven turned their professional gaze toward Brian's son, Gavin, treating him like a subject in one of their documentaries. They shadowed him through the streets, betting that the son would lead them to the father. Their patience paid off on June 10th. They watched Gavin drive to Burnt House Farm, an isolated property perfect for clandestine activities. They had found the location. Over the next few days, the cousins conducted intense surveillance, logging arrival times and mapping the routines of everyone who entered. They were not just planning a robbery to recover the debt. They were meticulously setting the stage for a house of horrors, gathering the intelligence needed to ensure that once the trap snapped, there would be no escape. It began like any other Thursday for the Waters family. At their home in Nantwich, Brian shared a morning with his wife Julie and their two children, Gavin, 25, and Natalie, who had just celebrated her 21st birthday. The sun was shining on the Cheshire plains, a deceptive calm, masking the storm that was gathering just miles away. While the family went about their routine, oblivious to the crosshairs painted on their backs, Christopher Guest Moore Jr. and James Raven had assembled a crew of violent enforcers specifically chosen for their lack of empathy. Among them was Otis Matthews, a hired muscle from Stretford known for his brutality, and David Moran, a drifter whose role was to facilitate the gang's movement. They loaded into a stolen horsebox, with Moran behind the wheel. The horsebox was a masterstroke of camouflage in the rural countryside, a vehicle that blended perfectly into the farming landscape, allowing a hit squad to roll right up to the front door without raising an eyebrow. When the horsebox pulled into the yard of Burnt House Farm, the men moved with military precision. Dressed in balaclavas and dark clothing, they stormed the property. But this was not a frantic raid. It was a methodical occupation. They secured the perimeter and began transforming the functioning cannabis farm into a slaughterhouse. They were not there to simply steal the drugs and leave. They were there to wait. The cowshed, usually filled with the pungent, earthy smell of growing plants, was prepped for a different purpose. They laid out their tools like surgeons, preparing for an operation, but their instruments were items of torture, heavy canes, industrial staple guns, and vats of caustic chemicals. As the gang lay in wait, the first victim arrived, but it was not Brian Waters. It was Sulaman Razak, the son of Brian's business partner. Razak walked through the door entirely unsuspecting, stepping out of the bright daylight and into a nightmare. He was ambushed instantly. The masked men swarmed him, overpowering him before he could even register the threat. He was dragged into the cowshed, where the gang decided to use him as a practice run for the violence to come. They demanded the location of the $20,000, money Razak knew absolutely nothing about. When he could not answer, the torture began. They bound his ankles with rope and threw the line over a sturdy wooden beam in the ceiling, hoisting him into the air until he dangled upside down, helpless and disoriented. On the floor beneath him sat a green plastic container, filled with filthy, stagnant water. Time and again, they lowered Razak's head into the fluid, holding him under until his lungs burned and panic set in, pulling him up only to gasp for air before dunking him again, a crude, terrifying form of waterboarding. But drowning was only the beginning. While he was wet and conductive, they applied high-voltage electricity to his body, the shocks convulsing his muscles in agony. The cruelty escalated with a terrifying creativity. They beat him with canes until his skin broke. They took phosphoric acid, a corrosive chemical used in the hydroponic growth of cannabis, and poured it onto his back. The acid sizzled against his flesh, causing chemical burns that seared through layers of skin. Then, in a moment that highlights the sheer inhumanity of the attackers, the staple gun was brought out. Industrial staples were fired directly into Razak's body, metal biting into flesh as if he were nothing more than a piece of upholstery. Finally, broken and barely conscious, he was bound to a chair with adhesive tape, left to listen to the sounds of the men preparing for their main target. By the time 10:00 p.m. approached and Brian Waters' pickup truck rolled down the driveway, the stage was fully set. The farm had been converted into a theater of pain, and the lead actor was about to walk onto the stage. As Brian pulled his pickup truck into the yard of Burnt House Farm that afternoon, the first thing he noticed was the anomaly, an unfamiliar horsebox parked near the entrance. In the quiet rhythm of farm life, where every vehicle and visitor is accounted for, its presence was a glaring red flag. A primal instinct, the kind that predates language, likely screamed at him to reverse, to spin the wheel and speed back down the lane, but curiosity, or perhaps the mundane assumption that it was just a delivery, pushed him forward. He stepped out of the truck and walked toward the door, unknowingly crossing the threshold between the world of the living and a world of absolute pain. The moment he entered, the trap snapped shut. Brian realized the danger instantly, but it was too late. He tried to flee, his boots scrambling for purchase on the concrete, but the masked men pounced with the coordination of a pack of wolves. They dragged him backward, his heels skidding across the floor, straight into the cowshed where Sulaman Razak already hung, suspended like a piece of meat. What followed was not a fight, it was a systematic dismantling of a human being. The gang did not just want to hurt Brian, they wanted to break him in ways that defied comprehension. For 3 agonizing hours, the cowshed echoed with the sounds of a nightmare. The torture was relentless, a calculated mix of medieval brutality and modern sadism. Brian was stripped and savagely beaten with canes, until his body was a mass of welts and bruises. But the physical beating was only the prelude. They forced his head into the same green barrel of filthy water used on Razak, holding him under until the thrashing stopped and the lungs spasmed for air, then pulling him up only to scream demands for the $20,000. Each time he gasped for breath, he was met with the terrifying face of his tormentors, and the same question he could not answer to their satisfaction. They hoisted him upside down by his ankles, the blood rushing to his head, his vision blurring as gravity turned against him. While he dangled there, helpless and disoriented, the industrial staple gun clicked and fired. Sharp metal projectiles were driven into his skin, puncturing his chest, his arms, his legs. His body became a canvas of violence, each staple a permanent marker of their cruelty. At one point, escalating the terror, they placed a plastic bag over his head and set it alight. The melting plastic, the smoke, and the suffocation combined into a panic-inducing crescendo of horror. Then came the act that shocked even the most hardened homicide detectives and pathologists, a violation so extreme, it spoke to a level of depravity rarely seen outside of war zones. The attackers took a metal iron bar and forced it inside Brian's rectum with such savage force that it struck the base of his spine. The internal damage was catastrophic. The pain indescribable. It was a calculated attempt to emasculate and destroy him from the inside out. Through it all, Brian's screams drifted out over the empty fields of Cheshire, swallowed by the isolation of the countryside. He was completely alone. Trapped in a concrete room with men who had lost their humanity, tortured over a debt that had likely already cost him far more than $20,000. And just when it seemed the nightmare could not get any worse, the sound of a car engine approached the farm. Brian's children had arrived. Later that afternoon, around 4:00 p.m., the tragedy deepened with the arrival of the innocents. Brian's children, Gavin and Natalie, pulled up to the farm, likely expecting nothing more than a routine visit to their father. Perhaps they were wondering why he had not answered his phone, or maybe they just wanted to see him. Whatever their reasons, they walked straight from the bright afternoon sun into the bowels of hell. The moment they stepped across the threshold, the trap that had snared their father now closed around them. They did not even have time to process the scene before the violence began. Gavin was immediately tackled, punched and kicked to the ground with ferocious intensity. A rope was thrown around his neck and pulled tight, choking him until his vision swam with darkness, and his lungs screamed for oxygen. Natalie, just 21 years old, faced a terror no young woman should ever endure. A cold steel gun barrel was shoved violently into her mouth, grinding against her teeth and tongue. The masked men screamed threats, promising unspeakable violations if she did not remain silent and compliant. But the physical assault paled in comparison to the psychological torture that followed. As they were subdued, their eyes adjusted to the dim light of the cowshed, and they saw him. Their father, the strong protector of their childhood, was a broken ruin. Brian was slumped in a chair, his body a map of agony, bloodied, beaten, and barely conscious. The air in the shed was thick with the metallic scent of blood and the acrid smell of fear. The gang did not shield the children from this sight. They used it. They forced Gavin and Natalie to watch, turning their father's suffering into a weapon to ensure their compliance. It was a theater of cruelty designed to break the human spirit entirely. At one point, the silence of the room was broken by Brian's weak, desperate voice, struggling against his restraints and the fluid filling his lungs. He begged his attackers for a sliver of mercy. "I can't breathe," he gasped, the words bubbling up through his injuries. "Please, I can't breathe." One of the men, perhaps tiring of the noise or feigning a moment of humanity, loosened the ropes slightly. But it was a futile gesture. The damage was catastrophic. Right there, in front of his son and daughter, Brian Waters' body finally gave out. His heart stopped, and he drew his final, labored breath. The man they loved died not in peace, but in a dirty cowshed, surrounded by monsters. With his children's screams ringing in his ears, the killers, devoid of any reverence for life, dragged his lifeless corpse across the concrete floor like a sack of refuse, dumping him unceremoniously in the adjacent milking parlor. But their night of terror was not finished. Two of the assailants took Brian's keys and drove his pickup truck to the family home in Nantwich. They kicked in the door and confronted Julie Waters, Brian's wife. They tore the house apart, ripping through drawers and cupboards in a frantic search for the elusive $20,000. When they found nothing, their frustration turned to cold malice. They kidnapped Julie from her own sanctuary, forcing her into the vehicle and driving her back to Burnt House Farm. They delivered her into the same nightmare that had already claimed her husband's life, reuniting the family in the most horrific way possible, surrounded by blood, trauma, and the silence of death. The facade of absolute control finally cracked from the inside. Stationed outside as a lookout while the slaughter unfolded, David Moran began to panic. Perhaps the screams piercing the farm walls were too much. Or perhaps he realized that a simple debt collection had spiraled into a capital crime. Whatever his motivation, Moran pulled out his phone and dialed 999. But even in this act of conscience, he remained a criminal. He posed as an innocent passerby, a bystander who had stumbled upon something suspicious, rather than an accomplice to murder. That call, however, was the loose thread that would unravel the entire conspiracy. When the police sirens cut through the rural air, chaos erupted at Burnt House Farm. The gang, so confident and domineering just moments before, scattered like cockroaches exposed to light. They sprinted across the farmyard and vanished into the dense hedgerows and fields of the Cheshire countryside. James Raven, the TV researcher turned torturer, was detained near the property almost immediately, but the others managed to slip into the shadows. Yet, in their desperate haste to flee, they left behind a treasure trove of forensic gold. The farm was littered with DNA evidence, discarded gloves, balaclavas thrown into rafters, cigarette butts, and fingerprints. They had been so focused on the torture that they had neglected the cleanup. When detectives entered the cowshed, the sight that greeted them was one of unparalleled horror. The post-mortem examination of Brian Waters read like a catalogue of war crimes. The pathologist recorded a staggering 123 separate external injuries. His torso was a ruin of shattered bone. He had sustained 11 broken ribs on his left side and 15 on his right. His lungs had collapsed under the trauma, slowly drowning him in his own blood. The internal injuries, particularly from the iron bar, confirmed a level of sadism that went beyond mere violence. It was hatred made manifest. The cause of death was not one single blow, but the cumulative effect of 3 hours of systemic abuse. Miraculously, Sulaman Razak, though broken and burned, had survived the ordeal, providing a living witness to the nightmare. While John Wilson and James Raven were swiftly arrested and charged, one key figure slipped through the net. Christopher Guestmore Jr. fled the country just 2 days after the murder. Using a fake passport, under the name Andrew Christopher Lamb, he boarded a flight to Spain and vanished. For the next 16 years, while his accomplices began life sentences with minimum terms of 24 years, Moore lived a life of stolen luxury. He settled in Malta, and later the Costa del Sol, working as a yacht captain and a businessman, hiding in plain sight among the expat community. He became one of Europe's most wanted fugitives, a ghost haunting the edges of the case. But justice, though delayed, is relentless. In 2019, the net finally tightened. Intelligence traced him to Malta, leading to a sophisticated international operation. When police finally cornered him, the man who had helped torture a father to death was living the high life, assuming he had outsmarted the system. He was extradited to the UK in 2021, grey-haired and aged, to face the consequences of that bloody afternoon in 2003. The jury showed him the same mercy he had shown Brian Waters, none. He was found guilty of murder and attempted murder, receiving a life sentence with a minimum of 24 years. The final piece of the puzzle had been placed, closing a 16-year chapter of evasion and bringing a grim satisfaction to a family that had lost everything. The murder of Brian Waters left a trail of devastation that extended far beyond the blood-stained concrete of Burnt House Farm. A devoted father and husband was not just killed, he was erased in a manner designed to inflict maximum psychological scarring on those who loved him. For the Waters family, the trauma did not end when the police tape was removed. Gavin and Natalie were forced to witness the dismantling of their father, a memory burned into their retinas that no amount of time or therapy can fully excise. Trust was shattered, innocence was stolen, and the sanctity of family was violated in the most absolute way imaginable. They live with the ghosts of that day, carrying the burden of a crime they did not commit but were forced to endure. And for what? The catalyst for this descent into madness was a debt of $20,000, a sum that, in the high-stakes world of international drug trafficking, is almost a rounding error. Brian's life, his children's mental health, his wife's future, all were incinerated over a dispute about money that likely did not even exist anymore. John Wilson, the man who ordered the hit to protect his reputation, sent a message to the underworld. Certainly. But the cost of that message was his own life. He traded his freedom for his ego. The mathematics of this revenge are stark and terrifying. $20,000 owed, 3 hours of torture, 123 injuries, and a minimum of 24 years in prison for everyone involved. Otis Matthews, James Raven, and eventually Christopher Guest Moore Jr. all received the same fate, decades behind bars, staring at concrete walls, left to contemplate the sheer futility of their violence. 3 other attackers remain unidentified, still walking free, perhaps looking over their shoulders, knowing that justice has a long memory. But even their freedom is a prison of its own, built on the fear of inevitable capture. In the criminal underworld, revenge is often romanticized as a necessary tool of power, but the story of Brian Waters strips away that glamour to reveal the ugly, rotting truth beneath. Revenge does not just destroy the target, it consumes the perpetrator and obliterates everything in its blast radius. If this story affected you, if it made you stare into the abyss of human cruelty and the high cost of a criminal life, please hit that like button. It helps us bring these dark truths to light. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a deep dive into the cases that define the darker side of humanity. Leave a comment below. Do you think the 24-year sentences were enough for the level of brutality inflicted that day? Share this video with others who need to understand that in the world of organized crime, there are no winners, only victims and prisoners. Brian Waters paid with his life. His family paid with their peace. And his killers are paying with their time.